Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 22nd of March 2019, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your hosts, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish. We're delighted to be joined by David Scott. David, of course, presenting Northern Exposure with reports from north of the border. Only one subject, Mike.
I just don't know where to start with it. Well, let's start with this.
I've just met with Donald Tusk following the EU Council's discussion on the UK's request for the approval of the Strasbourg supplementary documents and for a short extension to the Article 50 process. Firstly, I welcome the Council's approval of the legally binding assurances in relation to the Northern Ireland backstop, which I negotiated with President Juncker last week. After a lengthy discussion, the Council today also agreed, subject to a successful vote next week, that in order to provide time for the UK Parliament to agree and ratify a Brexit deal, the date of our departure will now be extended to the 22nd of May. If Parliament does not agree a deal next week, the EU Council will extend Article 50 until the 12th of April. At this point, we would either leave with no deal or put forward an alternative plan. If this involved a further extension, it would mean participation in the European parliamentary elections.
So, an alternative plan potentially coming, but I don't even really know where to start with this. An extension until the 22nd of May, assuming that her meaningful vote passes next week, which everybody's saying it isn't going to, which means 12th of April is the new leave date. Or is it? We'll come on to that in a moment. Because in the meantime, of course, on Wednesday evening, she presented her view of what was going on with Brexit and had some pretty nasty things to say about Parliament and MPs. It was all Parliament that's causing this problem. And she was asked about this yesterday after she gave that statement by Laura Kuenssberg from the BBC. She was asked, whether she regretted saying the things that she said on Wednesday night about the MPs, and this was her response to that.
Well, first of all, as I said, in relation to members of Parliament, there are passionately held views on all sides of this argument. And yes, as I said last night, I expressed frustration, but I know MPs are frustrated too. And I'm very grateful to those MPs who have supported the deal, to those who've come round to supporting the deal, having not previously done so, and to all those MPs that I've been meeting across the House and talking to about the issues that they are concerned about in relation to this deal. But I think what this decision tonight does is show the clear choice that is available, open to MPs. Getting the deal through next week in a meaningful vote means that we can have that extension to the 22nd of May, get our legislation through, deliver on the referendum, leave the European Union and do it in an orderly...
Well, and do it in an orderly fashion. We're going to extend. She said it again, we're going to extend. She's presuming a lot because, of course, the problem for Theresa May is she can't make this deal with the European Union. It's not possible because, well, as we've said already, this is the case. The European Union Withdrawal Act 2018, it says quite clearly in the legislation, exit day means 29th of March 2019 at 11 p.m. In other words, she cannot make a deal with the European Union on this and just assume that that's what's going to happen. This has to go back to Parliament. Parliament has to agree. There has to be an amendment to the EU Withdrawal Act in order to allow for this postponement. And the question then is, what order does this all happen in? She has to bring her meaningful vote back, get that either accepted or rejected, and only then does she know which date this has to be amended to. So here's the thing. Theresa May on Wednesday night made quite a big deal of the fact that she was putting the blame on MPs for what was going on with Brexit. It's all the MPs' fault, it's all Parliament's fault, it's not her fault, nothing to do with her whatsoever. And now she's going to come back and try to amend a piece of legislation in order to change the deal. But the problem is that we have it on good authority now that the House of Lords, there are elements within the House of Lords that are working extremely hard at the moment to block that attempt to extend the date to amend the EU Withdrawal Act. So in order to amend the Act, it has to be passed by the Commons. It also has to be passed by the Lords. If the Lords refuse to see this, then it can't pass. In the meantime then, on top of that, we have this going on, which is the Revoke Article 50 and Remain in the EU petition. It's been running for 24 hours now. Just before we came on air, it was over 3 million signatures in 24 hours. Now, there are many, many questions to be asked here. Is this a genuine reaction from the public, or is there some kind of shenanigans going on? People may have a view. Certainly Guido Fawkes yesterday was suggesting that there were shenanigans going on. But the Brexit camp has been popping out emails like this one saying it's official, Brexit has been delayed. This has been the government's plan all along, and they're asking for Brexit supporters to sign a counter petition. But the problem is that the Brexit campaign here is absolutely on the back foot. So we've got all this going on, and in the meantime, in the mainstream press, well, let's just take the Times as an example. What kind of stuff do we have? Brexit vote, Cobra takes over planning for no deal. So this is the government's emergency committee is going to be taking over the planning for no deal. This, on top of that, here is Chris Heaton-Harris, the Brexit minister, saying we also have Operation Yellowhammer, which is working to deliver the biggest peacetime project in the history of the civil service. Well, what is Operation Well, he said we do have this. He went on to say, leaving the European Union with a deal remains the government's top priority, but a responsible government must plan for the eventuality, including a no-deal scenario. So what is Operation Yellowhammer? Well, it triggers what was described in previous press reports as an unprecedented command and control structure in place across Whitehall. 3,500 troops ready to act within a matter of hours if the government needs extra tanker drivers, engineers, or military sniffer dogs at airports as the excuses that are being used for putting military on the streets. A Ministry of Defence source at the time said there are various stages of standby, 30 days, 5 days, 1 day. This will be on a ready-to-move basis. Now, we have reported in the past, I think before Christmas, that leave was being cancelled for around this time. This has been planned for, absolutely. But let's go on with the mainstream media.
Can I just say there, though, Mike, find the name of the Operation Yellowhammer. I think that is very significant because, to me, that's a sort of snide backhand stab at yellow vests. And what they're saying there is that if there's any form of yellow vest activity in UK, it is going to be hammered. That's definitely a choice for the name of that operation, and it's been chosen very, very cynically.
Well, I agree with you. They claim it's named after the little bird. I don't think that quite fits, but no. Anyway, let's move on. Again, the Times, we must now sort out the constitutional mess exposed by Brexit. This is a key point because Theresa May was very clear on Wednesday night that in her view it was MPs that were responsible, it was Parliament that was responsible, so that was a direct attack on the House of Commons. If the House of Lords, as we believe is going to happen, make an attempt to block the amendment of the EU Withdrawal Act, then of course you can imagine the headlines at that point. This unelected chamber blocking Brexit, this is the type of headlines we're going to get. This is a constitutional crisis, is what we're seeing in the press. But as David Ellis said on Wednesday, this is not a constitutional crisis. This is a crisis that the government has with the Constitution. In other words, the Constitution is getting in the way of what Theresa May is, in her divine right, attempting to do, which is to push through a plan which everybody agrees that believes or is campaigning for Brexit, understands is not any kind of Brexit at all, and in fact ties us into the EU very closely. Then we've got this type of thing from Dan Snow. We are not powerless to stop Brexit. We must fill the streets. So this, along with the petition, which has appeared out of nowhere, they're clearly attempting to ramp up the idea in people's minds that there's a massive backlash against Brexit at the moment, that the popular demand now is that we actually remain. And then we have the fear-mongering again here. This is Sky News from last night. So Sky News can reveal the armed forces have activated a team in a nuclear bunker beneath the Ministry of Defence to step up preparations for a no-deal Brexit. So they tweeted that out last night. Very emotive language, again attempting to provoke fear response and perhaps encourage more people to get behind the notion that we should stay in the EU. So I'm going to suggest that at this point that as all the ducks are lining up in a row, and if we bear in mind that any time any Tory MP or Tory EU minister was asked about the possibility that we would actually revoke Article 50, none of them was prepared to say that was not possible. They simply said it's unlikely. Well, in fact, it looks to me like the ducks are lining up to make it much more likely.
Yeah, perhaps we should bring David
yes.
in, actually.
David, what are your thoughts on this then?
Well, the lack of honesty is really striking. Theresa May stands there and she says a little phrase, and the amount of deception in it is remarkable. She said, to see if Parliament can agree a Brexit deal. That implies that there is some scope for negotiation. That implies there's some degree of choice, right? That there's more than one thing on offer. There's only one thing on offer: compliance. You have to accept what the EU says and say, yes, that's the deal that's on offer. Is that not right? So there is no choice, but there's this pretense that we're having a negotiation and we're not being dictated to. Yeah, sorry, Mike, you say?
No, I was just going to say I agree with you.
Yeah, we're watching subversion, David. In my opinion, we're seeing this come to the surface. This country is being taken apart from the inside. It's being taken apart with a very devious, calculated plan. That plan has run across all three the major parties. We know that. We are simply being ripped apart. The constitution is being torn up. We are beholden to the EU. And as several people in our chat room have picked up on, how interesting to see suddenly Theresa May is in bright clothes and she's smiling. She is looking happy because her long-term objective to actually crush Brexit is very nearly complete. She's nearly done it. And as other people are saying in the chat box, how interesting that as this subversion, treason at the heart of the British government takes place, they're threatening the public to use British troops on them. This is, well, I'm lost for words, but we are watching UK taken apart. David, this is your government of occupation. These people, whatever they are, they're not British. They don't have British values in the widest sense. They don't have a conscience. They don't have a morality. They are selling this nation and its constitution out to a foreign power. And that foreign power is the European Union, which, as we're going to hear later, Mike, is declaring itself as a superpower. This is treason.
This is treason, and government of occupation is an increasingly accurate term. Now, you mentioned the military. In fact, you mentioned the British military. Now, this is a very interesting angle to this. The dates, for example, are quite coincidental, right? So we had Brexit on the 29th and we're now on the 12th of April. It does strike me that it's at least quite a significant coincidence that we've got Operation Joint Warrior 191, where 10,000 foreign troops are going to assemble in Faz Lane all around the British nuclear deterrent. And that runs from the 30th of March until the 11th of April. That seems a little coincidental, and at least pause for thought. If we're seeing troops on the streets, they might not necessarily be British. If we see betrayal by the establishment, by the parliament, by the political elite, where is any resistance going to come from? It's probably going to be the military. So you're going to see odd things happening in the British military. I would suspect you would see people changing post or senior officers being dismissed very quietly as resistance is removed. We should be watching for strange things happening with the British military, because the British military still are loyal to the British people.
I'm just going to check one thing with you there, because you said betrayal by the British Parliament. I'm going to argue, and I'm interested in your views on this. I'm going to argue that the betrayal isn't from the British Parliament at the moment. The betrayal is from the British government, particularly this form of government that we have at the moment, which is effectively controlled by the Cabinet Office. What we're seeing, the reason we're seeing the chaos, isn't so much that Parliament, the rest of the MPs, don't know what they want out of Brexit, but I think, in a sense, they understand this betrayal from the executive. Then they actually don't know what to do about that, because they don't understand the Constitution and what options they have in order to try to hold the executive within the limitations that it's supposed to be held to. So perhaps we need to be careful about suggesting that the Parliament is betraying us here, because it seems to me that it's a subsection of that. But correct me if you disagree.
I disagree in part. I mean, it's certainly led by the executive and by the Cabinet Office, and that's where all the decisions are made. And Parliament is becoming ever less important. David Ellis's point about the fact that parliamentarians are no longer being lobbied because they're irrelevant, it was extremely astute. But there is a few other points to this. What do they know? Okay, if they're confused, well, what can they do? They can stand up, they can put their shoulders back, and they can tell the truth. They're not doing this. How many parliamentarians are telling the truth about EU military unification? None. They know, they absolutely know, and they're saying nothing. So there is, what is it, in silence there is consent? That's happening for sure.
Yes. Okay, well, let's move on to this. Now, this was in the Daily Mail a few days ago. Watch out, Putin. Huge American B-52s that can carry nuclear weapons land at RAF base as part of the largest US bomber deployment in the UK since the Iraq War. They say the arrival is ahead of a NATO exercise in Georgia, a show of force against Vladimir Putin's neighboring Russia. Exercise comes 11 years after the two countries' former Soviet Union partners fought a 9-day war. NATO said exercise's aim, which begins tomorrow, is to improve interoperability between NATO and Georgia. So that was, I believe, from last Friday. Well, NATO has now published some information about this. They've published a nice photograph, as you can see there. And they're saying that the US Air Force sent 6 B-52 long-range bombers to the United Kingdom for a series of training exercises over Europe. The aircraft and over 450 airmen arrived at RAF Fairford on Thursday, the 14th of March 2018 from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. This is a routine deployment, according to Wana Lugescu, who's the NATO spokeswoman, but it shows that the US umbrella protects Europe and demonstrates the unique capabilities the US could bring to Europe in a crisis. The B-52 deployment is yet another sign that the United States is strongly committed to NATO. Well, a number of news outlets here. This is the Chinese Xinhua news outlet, showing that the Russians have got a little bit upset about the fact that the Americans have flown one of these B-52s quite close to the Russian borders. Well, in fact, in a couple of days' time, Jens Stoltenberg will now travel to Tbilisi on Sunday and Monday. And he will have meetings with the Georgian Prime Minister. So there seems to be a bit of a ramping up of NATO activities in that part of the world. What is Putin's response supposed to be to that?
Well, I think Putin's got to be very careful, Mike. I think the game here is that they've got the ring of steel around Russia at the moment. Now you play games, you're bringing forces in close to the Russian border, you're putting aircraft in the skies close to the Russian airspace, and all this is ramping up tension. So it only requires the Russians to make a mistake or to do something and engage one of these aircraft, and then we've got an excuse for the US, NATO, EU war against Russia. That's how I see it. Of course, what you were doing the whole time in the Cold War is trying to de-escalate things. So exercises were planned, were announced in advance so that each side knew what was happening and knew what to expect. And they did have one or two cases where things nearly kicked off simply because of misinterpretation over exercises. So these things are very dangerous, and the Americans know it, but I think that at the moment the American system does not care. They are out to goad Russia into taking reaction. That's my opinion.
So they're bear baiting. So where does that leave Europe then? Well, this obviously happened a few weeks ago. This is Federica Mogherini at the Munich Security Conference. But in the context of Brexit and in the context of what NATO's up to, it's probably quite important to have a look at it now. So David, what were your thoughts on this?
It's a very remarkable conference. They put out a briefing paper that has a broad overview of everything security related, and there's one or two real standout points in it. One is that in terms of the military industrial complex in Europe, 40% of it is British, and that doesn't include the part that we've got in trans-European initiatives like Airbus. So you're talking a huge part of the military manufacturing capability is British, which explains why we have to be part of it. It explains why military union is going on despite Brexit. And it also, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, they also started off with a quote from Antonio Gramsci, the originator of cultural Marxism and an Italian communist of fame. And he was talking about the time essentially when normal government breaks down, and the Munich Security Council was suggesting that now is such a time.
Well, let's just listen to a few little bits from Mogherini's speech from this, because she makes a couple of interesting comments here.
The Munich Security Report that was presented ahead of this conference says we are living in, and also our global strategy says, we're living in complex times. I was surprised to see that the report, the Munich Security Report, uses a famous quote by Antonio Gramsci, saying that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. It couldn't be more appropriate to describe our times. We also know that military means are never sufficient alone. And this is why we have, in the last 2 years, built at last the European defence. A dream that our founding fathers and mothers always dreamt of, but never managed to accomplish. And now it's done. Now, the Munich Security Report talks about European countries as middle powers. I think this is even generous. I think, and I would even say that individually, our countries are small. I often say our member states are not small or big ones. We have member states that have not yet realized they are small. But together, joining forces, we are definitely a superpower, economically and also in security terms. I am sure that the Europe of defence is no longer the impossible dream of our founders. It is already today contributing to our common security, and its contribution, I believe, will become even more evident in the coming years. The Europe of defence is now a reality with solid foundations, and this is our contribution, the European Union contribution to the security of our citizens, first and foremost, but also it is our commitment to a more cooperative, multilateral new world order. Thank you very much.
Well, David, aside from the fact that the deal is done, according to Ms. Mogherini, the thing that really struck me about that was, of course, she was giving that presentation just down the road. Tony Blair was giving an interview, and we've shown some of the video from that on this programme and on our Twitter feed and so on. You know, she was talking about the size of European countries and how in order to compete, they've got to get together in order to become this superpower. And this is exactly the words that were coming out of Tony Blair's mouth. And so my question then is, you know, we know that she has this special relationship with Jens Stoltenberg at NATO, but I've got to wonder whether she's got some kind of special relationship with Tony Blair as well, because it's almost like she's speaking his words.
It's amazing how many people we're seeing these days that sound like Tony Blair. It is almost as though there's a much greater influence behind the scenes than we're seeing. She said that in that Gramsci quote, the old is dying, the new is not yet born, and this was an absolutely ideal description of now. So the old that is dying, that would be the nation state, presumably. The new that's not yet born, what exactly is that?
Well,
It's not specified.
that is the multilateral New World Order, isn't it? That's what she said.
Well, yes, okay, multilateral New World Order, and based on pan-European empirism.
Well, it's got to be the trilaterals here, isn't it? That you're creating these massive power blocks. So it's the Americas, it's Europe, Eurasia, because the plan includes Russia. The Russians not playing at the moment, and then you've got the Pacific and the Pacific Rim, China and Japan and the Pacific Rim countries. So we know that the trilateral commission and their policy for three major power blocks is a huge stepping stone to this rules-based international order, the New World Order. They're just not saying this now.
Well, yes, they weren't saying it until very recently. Yes, and I did like the way she was absolutely clear. Now it's done. This is a done deal. Other parts of the speech went on to explain that what remains to be achieved in terms of military union is simply consolidating the gains that have already been established. There's nothing more significant to be done. So all of the framework is in there. So all of the people who are out there saying, well, there's no EU army, this is all conspiracy theory, it's already a done deal.
Yes, and the last piece of that is whether the UK is involved in it, and of course we are, as Theresa May has said, and others on many occasions, more committed to the EU's to security, which includes defence. You know, and we're going to have a relationship of greater breadth and depth than we've ever had before. So there is no question we are 100% behind it and part of it. But now, in the meantime, Gavin Williamson, we'll be glad to know, has decided to spend £1.5 billion on buying some Boeing E-7 aircraft for airborne early warning. Well, this is quite interesting because this has been a discussion that's gone on for quite some time. He's jumped apparently with this aircraft. Anybody that recognises the airframe, of course, will recognise it is a Boeing 737. I suppose, would need to hope that it's not based on a Max 800 or something like that, but a Max 8 or a Max 9. But anyway, this was I think this was a Telegraph article reposted by MSN just prior to Christmas. MOD under fire over plan to buy jets from Boeing and disastrous capita recruitment deal. But sticking with the Boeing thing, this was Gavin Williamson giving evidence to the Defence Select Committee, and they were really questioning him about why he was looking at buying the Boeing E-7 instead of the Airbus equivalent. He said that this was the most logical and cost-effective option. It was taking risk out of the programme. And this was being echoed by Air Vice Marshal Richard Knighton, who was saying that the Airbus option was a paper airplane. It had never actually flown. It wasn't proven. But the point was that the E-7 was already 15 years old, parts of it already obsolete. Brian, I got a question why we would proceed with an aircraft that is coming towards the end of its life cycle rather than something which is at the beginning.
Fascinating question, particularly as we have a look at Nimrod. So we had to get rid of Nimrod because of the same reason we're getting this one.
Yes.
Okay.
There you go. Okay, right. Quick reminder, if you like what we're doing and you'd like to support us, then please head over to ukcolumn.org/community and you can join up there. Various membership options available, and that would be very much appreciated.
Okay, well, we've got to report straight away on Robert Green because there's been huge interest in Robert's well-being over the last 24 hours. I'm pleased to say I've been able to speak to his immediate family. We're going to give this report. I'll say a little bit more. Respected child abuse campaigner Robert Green is recovering from a serious illness. His close family have asked that his medical condition is not shared at present and that supporters do not try and contact Robert until he's fit enough to appreciate correspondence. The UK column will update everyone as soon as we can, but we are very pleased to say that Robert is now making good progress. That is the message that we've been asked to put out by Robert's close family. I can tell our viewers and listeners that Robert Green has been seriously ill. He is in hospital at the moment. I'm not at liberty to disclose where he is, but we are going to ask that people respect the wishes of his family at the moment, and we will give you updates as soon as we can. Hopefully we might be able to give an update on Monday, but this is a great shame, and of course Robert has never stopped doing his campaigning work to try and expose and prevent child abuse. Well, against that background, let's have a look at what's happening under the smokescreen of Brexit, because it is quite clear that the Conservative government is also doing a fantastic job, a skilled job, Mike, in covering up child abuse in the corridors of power in Westminster and in the establishment, as it conducts a gentleman's blind eye investigation, the so-called ICSA child abuse inquiry. What have they been doing? Well, a few days ago they were interviewing Kenneth Clarke. Now I've got quite a lot here. I'll try and do it as quickly as I can so we can have some discussion. But this took place on Friday the 15th of March. Let's just have a look at some of the things that were said. Surprisingly, Ken Clarke was very candid about the fact there were paedophiles at his school. The school I was at had one teacher who every pupil knew was a paedophile. I mean, he never molested me. I was lucky. I don't think he molested many people, but now I talk to people I went to school with, and we all knew we'd got this one chap who, if you'd got any sense, knew we'd get this. If we got any sense, you'd stay away from. So I'm going to paraphrase a bit of it there. There's a little bit of repetition. I don't think people appreciated quite what lasting damage it did to the victims. This is an amazing statement from a man who has been so dismissive of the idea that paedophiles have been operating in Parliament, along with his other colleagues, David Cameron, for example. So let's go on to the next one here. He said, I had a liberal 1960s type approach to these things, but it didn't extend to paedophilia. Whereas my views when it came to homosexuals was, I was quite prepared to, I wouldn't disclose that to anybody because I couldn't quite see why it was a criminal offence. So that's an amazing statement to me, Mike, because the law at the time was that it was unlawful to engage in that. So what he's actually telling us is that he was prepared not to follow the law in order to protect people who were in breach of the law at that time. We could have a moral discussion about it, but the facts are that the law said this should not be going on. It appears that Mr. Clarke turned a blind eye to homosexuality at that time. Back to the school, I suspect that the school staff over the years must have known, but for some peculiar reason, probably because of the threat to the reputation of the school, but even then you couldn't have quietly got him at least to leave, but they didn't. It went on. So now we acknowledge that there was a paedophile, at least one paedophile operating in the school. Nobody did anything. Nobody forced him to leave. Nobody took the matter to the police. It carried on, and he admits the horrific impact on children. David, just to bring you in quickly, I find this a really remarkable admission from Kenneth Clarke. He knows about paedophilia. The poor man had to endure paedophiles running unchecked in his school. But as we're going to see shortly, when it comes to the idea that they're running unchecked in Westminster, he's got a bit of a blank memory.
Yes, this liberal 1960s approach he talked about, that sounds like something that's quite flexible and may cover a multitude of sins. Yes, please go on. I'm fascinated to know what's coming next.
Well, I've just taken excerpts. Obviously, people can find the actual full questioning online, but let's go on here. He says, well, the turnover in the House of Commons is quite brisk. There are over 600 members. I must by now well have served alongside probably thousands of people and members of parliament. It would be astonishing if amongst these there weren't one or two paedophiles. And later, after I was in the whip's office, there were of course rumours. There were rumours about 2 or 3 members, but with the exception of Cyril Smith, none of which I would have altogether believed. So he accepts on a statistical basis, highly likely that there's paedophiles in Westminster, but then very quickly sort of conflates that with its rumours. Let's go on. The trouble with people going for this kind of gossip, and it is Whip's office, you know, it's gossip we're talking about, is once someone starts getting gossiped about in some sexually scandalous way, it gets repeated. It never actually stops. People who enjoy gossip just relate it to somebody else and it soon becomes established fact. So, you know, in modern times, I think the allegations about Leon Britton and Ted Heath were just ludicrous, but you found people who believed them. Going back in time, Peter Morrison, Grenville Janner, as far as I'm aware, no one ever established there was any substance to them. It was just 1 or 2 people start gossiping, all the people who like to pretend they're in the know just repeat it. And I wonder how the boys managed to deal with this problem at his school. Did the boys talk to each other? And there was, he says, he believes a paedophile unchecked in his school, but the idea this is going on in Westminster is a bit of a problem. Well, here we go. He's talking about Cyril Smith. Of all these, I mean, Cyril Smith, it's now public knowledge that he obviously was a paedophile. I think the idea that Leon Britton and Ted Heath were is just ludicrous. And I suspect, I have no idea whether Peter was, but I very, very much doubt it. It's all nonsense, it's all speculation, it's all gossip once we get to pointing a finger at MPs in Westminster. Now, one of the questions that was put to him is this: was there also perhaps a keenness to know about any sort of press scandals that might be about to emerge? This is in relation really to the Whip's office. They didn't emerge in those days because the House of Commons, we didn't run those scandals. There was a kind of, it was very rare for celebrity scandals involving politicians. So, but yes, if there had been likely to be some scandal, yes, we'd have liked to have heard it first and warned political leaders that this was coming so they could, quote, handle it. But there wasn't a major, no one exposed in any scandal that I can recall in my time. So this is just amazing. The Whip's office was there in order to help prepare and control scandals, but definitely nobody heard anything to do with the abuse of children. But he says there was a dirt book or a black book, yes, which you reported things you thought might have been of interest to the Chief Whip in particular and your colleagues, and it was kept in the cupboard, and you would put an entry in it if you picked up something interesting, and actually you could read it if you wanted to. Why do you think they would keep a book of dirt, Mike?
Well, I think he's misnamed it. It wasn't a black book, was it? It was blackmail book.
Well, that's the impression you get. They wanted to know dirt on people. Why do you want to know dirt on people? Because you can then put them under pressure. We don't have to call it blackmail. We can say we just put them under a bit of pressure. Fascinating insight. Let's go on. Can you, in a few sentences, give us a description of how life was back in those days in the Whip's office? Well, it was we were a tight little club. We were chosen because of a range of our views, a range of ages. I think along with 1 or 2, well, indeed one of the others, I was a fairly new elected member. The House in those days sat for much longer, sat in the night, became a political village in the evening. Everybody came in the bars and the tea rooms. You picked up the gossip and got to know your colleagues, which meant you hoped nothing would take you by surprise, and you saw any political trouble coming, tried to head it off and smooth the way. David, this is a fairly clear explanation as to what the Whips were up to, but remarkably, Mr. Clark completely unaware of anybody who was there possibly abusing children.
Yes, he couldn't have been paying attention because Tim Fortescue said on the BBC that it might be a case involving small boys.
Well,
that was one of the things that they would cover up. They covered up.
I'm glad you've introduced that, because just a couple of minutes, that was one of the things he was asked about. But before we get there, let's continue with the idea that anything to do with child abuse involving politicians or the establishment is ludicrous. He said this: "Oh, in the present atmosphere, I suspect any whip who gets any evidence of any criminal activity gets the police in pretty quickly. Otherwise, everybody's looking for conspiracy theories and celebrity scandals and all the rest of it on a slightly ludicrous scale." I mean, we've just had, I'm sure this inquiry is conducting a perfectly serious inquiry, but I've just read now ludicrous things about sex orgies in Dolphin Square and all the rest of it, and establishment conspiracies to cover up, both of which I regard as internet ridiculous nonsense. But the present whip's office will be sensitive to all that, so I'm sure they'll be off to the police if someone admitted shoplifting at the drop of a hat. It's all dismissed, and here's your point, David, because I can really paraphrase it very simply. When he was asked what he made of Tim Fortescue's comments to BBC Camera about when MPs who'd been involved in the abuse of little boys came to the whips fixed it. And Tim Fortescue said, so that they would do as we asked. That's your blackmail, Mike. But Ken Clarke said, well, he never heard anything about this sort of thing. And Tim Fortescue had been there for a long time before him. So he really didn't know anything about it. Well, one question that he wasn't asked about that I could see, possibly it was, but I couldn't see it. He wasn't asked about his time as health minister and Jimmy Savile being given access to NHS facilities, including Broadmoor. So that appears to have escaped the inquiry, but maybe he'd be called in later for that. We just remind people that we could be putting up hundreds of articles where abuse victims have come forward to talk about being abused by politicians, not just Tory, of course, across the parties. And we can also point out that the moment these allegations surface, up step powerful people like David Cameron to say this is all nonsense, or perhaps we should go to Lord Steele. Even when he knew the abuse was going on, he said it had nothing to do with him. Or we could turn to Boris Johnson, who talked about ejaculating up the wall, £60 million of money wasted investigating child abuse. And against that backdrop, when we have Met police officers coming to the fore to talk about the abuse and the cover-up, they are prevented from standing in front of the inquiry, as indeed was Melanie Shaw. This is the response from the inquiry saying the chair does not consider it necessary to hear from her at the hearing. I mean, if you're doing an inquiry into child abuse, Mike, you wouldn't want anybody who knew anything about child abuse to speak, would you?
No, you'd encourage people like Ken Clarke to come along, who apparently doesn't know anything about it.
No, he doesn't. So there we are. There's the Truth Project. It says, I will be heard. But of course, the answer is no, you won't. And just to be a little bit poignant, this is a letter from Melanie Shaw, where she was saying that she worked voluntarily for her MP, who was Shadow Treasury Secretary of State. Now look at what they've done to me. She's talking about Chris Leslie. She said at the top, if it weren't for me, no investigation of any children's home would have happened. She's talking about Nottingham. The system is shit, her words, but I have to conform to it. So there we are. Theresa May, we've entrusted with negotiating Brexit. But of course, at the end of the day, the Conservatives are perfectly happy to cover up the abuse of children. So can we expect any decency with Brexit? I don't think so, Mike.
No.
Where do we go from that? I think we should change the subject. And David, you've got some points on
well, the Golan Heights.
Golan
David,
Heights.
just briefly.
Right, so this is a photograph I took in the Golan Heights, and you see there a German 88mm pointing down at the Sea of Galilee, and this is one of the tourist attractions in the Golan Heights. So you'll appreciate that the population in Israel views the strategic safety of some of their heartland as bound up with possession of the Golan. Now, it's been occupied since 1967, fought over twice, 67 and 73. And well, it transpires that Donald Trump, via Twitter, has changed the American policy completely. He said, after 52 years, it's time for the United States to fully recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which is of critical strategic and security importance to the state of Israel and regional stability. So his view there is that the Golan must remain in Israeli hands in perpetuity, and that to seek to place it back under Syrian control would destabilize the whole area. It's a point of view, and it's not without some justification, because almost any change you make in the Middle East destabilizes the whole area. But this is a dramatic and via Twitter change in American policy, because the American, the UN, Britain, the EU, everyone else has had the view that this is occupied territory and will at some point be returned to Syria as long as Israeli security can be assured and they can be confident that they are safe from attack. So that seems to be the official line, but Donald Trump is taking an entirely different one. Now, Harrods here is wondering why now. They say that since no one is even trying to pretend any longer that Donald Trump isn't intervening in Israel's election on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's behalf, the only question left is to ask the US president, is to ask why. Why now? Has the US president decided to plump for Israeli sovereignty over the Golan? The Jerusalem Post here is also pointing out that this statement has achieved very little. There's been very little reaction. They're saying that maybe the status of the Golan really isn't all that important anymore. I wonder whether it's in fact the status of the United States and the United States president that isn't all that important anymore. I think there are more powerful moves afoot. But they're seeing that this statement has gone almost uncommented in the Arab world. No one seems to have cared.
And what are your thoughts about that?
I think it's an example that the United States' influence in the Middle East is declining. It's being replaced by Europe, and that's going to continue. And the conflict there is going to be between Arab and Muslim interests, Russian interests, and European interests, with America becoming ever more marginal. And the American diktat will no longer carry very much weight.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, serious times. We'll end there. David, thank you for joining us. We'll say to our viewers and listeners, if you like what we're doing, please support us. We need your financial support. So if you're not already a subscriber or you haven't already donated, please consider doing so. And of course, we're always immensely grateful for people who have enough confidence to take out the life subscription for UK Column. And I'll just remind our viewers and listeners again that Robert Green has been seriously ill. He is now starting to recover in hospital, but his close family have said, please at the moment, give them some peace and some space. As soon as Robert is able to cope with a bit of wider communication, we will be happy to let people know. But thank you for the kind support that you've been offering to Robert, and we'll make sure that is passed on in general. That's it for today. We'll be back at the same time. Well, hopefully we may be fully subsumed into the European Union over the weekend. Who knows? We hope to see you on Monday at 1 o'clock. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.